In 2009, two men sat in the same university lecture hall. Same degree, same grades, same starting point. One took the safe option: corporate job, steady salary, pension, stability. Everyone around him said it was the smart choice. The other did something everyone called reckless. He started a company. It struggled for 3 years. He nearly quit twice. His parents were worried. His friends thought he was making a mistake. 14 years later, the man who took the safe option is a senior manager. Good salary, good title, no assets. The man who did the reckless thing has a net worth of $4 million. What the safe man discovered, in a conversation he almost didn't have, was not that he had made a bad decision. He had made a perfectly reasonable decision. He had just never understood what it was actually costing him. And by the time someone explained it, 14 years had passed. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll know exactly how to calculate what your safe decisions are costing you right now. David Okafor was, by every conventional measure, a success. 38 years old, senior manager at a logistics company. Salary in the top 15% of earners his age. A mortgage on a house that had appreciated. A pension his HR department called on track. 2 children in good schools. A life that made his parents proud. He was not struggling. He was not in crisis. Nothing was broken. And yet, there was a number David had been avoiding for several years. Not his salary. He knew that. Not his mortgage balance. He knew that too. The number he had been avoiding was the one that answered a question he had never quite allowed himself to ask out loud. What am I actually worth? Not to his employer. Not in terms of salary. What did he own? What was working for him while he slept? What would keep generating value if he stopped generating it himself? One Sunday evening, he finally sat down with a spreadsheet and did the calculation. The answer was almost nothing. The house had equity. The pension had a projected value. Beyond those two things, 14 years of employment, 14 years of excellent performance reviews, 14 years of being exactly the kind of professional that companies depend on. And at the end of it, he was worth, in any meaningful sense, almost exactly what he had been worth at 24. Plus a pension. He closed the spreadsheet, sat for a long time, then called a number he had kept in his phone for 2 years, a mentor he had met once, spoken to briefly, and never followed up with. Because he had always told himself he would call when things were clearer, when he had more time, when he knew exactly what he wanted to ask. On this particular Sunday evening, none of those conditions were met. He called anyway. What that man said next, David was not prepared for. They met the following Thursday. A quiet restaurant in the city. Early evening. Arthur Blake arrived first. Gray suit. Silver hair. A glass of water. Reading something on paper. The particular stillness of someone for whom being early is simply how they move through the world. David sat down, ordered coffee, and tried to explain, in the organized way that 14 years of corporate life had trained him, what he had called about. He talked for 3 minutes. Arthur listened without interrupting. Then Arthur said, "You haven't told me what the problem is yet. You've told me what your life looks like. That's different. Tell me the number. The one you calculated on Sunday." David had not mentioned the spreadsheet. David said, "How did you?" Arthur said, "Because everyone who calls me eventually gets to a Sunday with a spreadsheet." What was the number? David said, "Basically nothing. Outside the house and the pension." Arthur said, "And you've been working for 14 years. David said, "Yes." Arthur said, "And you made the safe choice. At every major decision point." It was not a question. David said, "I made sensible choices. I have a family. I have responsibilities." Arthur said, "I know, and I'm not questioning the choices. I'm questioning the word you used to describe them. You called them safe. And I want you to genuinely consider whether any decision that costs you 14 years of compounding and leaves you with almost no assets can reasonably be described as safe." David was quiet. Arthur said, "Because from where I'm sitting, the decision that felt safe was the most expensive decision you ever made. You just couldn't see the cost. And that's exactly why it felt safe." David said, "You're saying the corporate job was a mistake." Arthur said, "I'm saying the corporate job was a choice. And like every choice, it had a cost. What I'm saying is that you never calculated the cost. Because the cost was invisible. And human beings are not wired to see invisible costs." David said, "What invisible cost?" Arthur said, "Time. Compounding. Optionality. The things that grow silently when you build something and stay flat when you work for someone else. When you took that job at 24, What were you afraid of? David said, failure. Not being able to provide. Making a mistake I couldn't recover from. Arthur said, all reasonable fears. And the job removed them. Or appeared to. So your brain registered the decision as safe, because the things you were afraid of did not happen. But here is what your brain could not register, because it is not designed to register invisible things. The company you didn't start. The equity you didn't accumulate. The compounding that didn't happen. The options you gave up in exchange for the salary. These are not dramatic losses. They make no noise. They appear on no statement. There is no moment where you experience their absence as pain. And so, for 14 years, your brain has been receiving one signal. You are safe. While the things that cost you everything accumulated invisibly. Think about your own life right now. How many decisions have you called safe, simply because nothing visibly went wrong? Because that is not the definition of safe. That is the definition of invisible cost. Arthur said, there is a concept in psychology called loss aversion. Human beings feel the pain of a loss approximately twice as intensely as the pleasure of an equivalent gain. We are wired, deeply, evolutionarily wired, to avoid visible loss. The job offered you the absence of visible loss. No failure, no crisis, no moment where you could point and say, that went wrong. And so your brain classified it as the safe option. But safety is not the absence of visible loss. Safety is the preservation of future options. A decision that removes visible risk while quietly eliminating future options is not a safe decision. It is a slow trade. You traded 14 years of compounding for 14 years of income. And income, unlike compounding, stops the moment you stop. Write that down, because that one sentence describes where most people's wealth actually went. David said, that's not entirely fair. Not everyone can start a company. Arthur said, you're right. And I'm not saying everyone should. What I am saying is that the framing of the choice, safe versus reckless, was wrong from the beginning. And because you accepted that framing, you never asked the real question. The real question was never, should I take the safe option or the reckless one? The real question was, which option preserves the most optionality over time? Which option builds something that grows independently of my continued presence? Which option gives me the most paths forward 10 years from now, not just the most stability today? Framed that way, the answer might still have been the corporate job, but it would have been accompanied by a deliberate plan to build ownership alongside it. Not instead of it, alongside it. Instead, you accepted the salary as the destination. And for 14 years, you have been traveling in a direction that does not lead to what you were told it would lead to. David said, which is what? Arthur said, real security. The kind that does not depend on continued employment. Because here is the thing about what you have built. It is entirely contingent on your employer's continued goodwill. If that goodwill ends, through restructuring, through a change in leadership, through an economic shift, your income ends. And you have built very little that continues to generate value in its absence. That is not security. That is dependency that feels like security, because it has not been tested yet. Here is the psychological mechanism I want you to understand. The brain evaluates safety based on what it can see. Visible risk feels dangerous. Invisible cost feels neutral. But invisible cost is not neutral. It compounds. Over 14 years, the invisible cost of not building ownership is not the salary you didn't earn. It is the compounding that didn't happen, the options that didn't open, the equity that wasn't built, the income streams that were never created. And here is what makes this so specifically difficult to see. You are not in pain. Your life is not visibly failing. There is no crisis to point to, which means your brain keeps telling you, the safe choice worked. When what it should be telling you is, the safe choice is still costing you, quietly, every day, in currency you cannot see. David said, so what do I do now? Arthur said, stop optimizing for the absence of visible loss and start building for the presence of independent value. At 24, that might have meant starting something. At 38, it means something different. It means looking at the 14 years of expertise, relationships, and credibility you have built, and asking a question you have never formally asked. What do I know that someone would pay for outside of my employer? What have I built that has value beyond the role I hold? And what could I construct, gradually, alongside the job, that would generate income without requiring my constant presence? Because the opportunity cost of the past 14 years cannot be recovered. But the opportunity cost of the next 14 years is entirely within your control. The question is whether you will spend them the same way. David did not leave that dinner with a plan. He left with a reframe. And a reframe, he was beginning to understand, was more valuable than a plan. Because a plan without a reframe gets abandoned when it gets hard. A reframe changes what the plan is for. He drove home thinking about one word Arthur had used: optionality. He had never thought about his decisions in those terms. He had thought about them in terms of risk, safe versus reckless. But optionality was different. Optionality was about paths, about how many directions remained open, about whether the decision he was making today was closing doors or keeping them open. He got home, sat at the kitchen table, opened the spreadsheet he had closed on Sunday. But this time, he added a column he had never included before. Not what he owned, what he knew. 14 years in logistics operations, supply chain optimization, 3 industries, dozens of supplier relationships, a specific expertise in a specific kind of problem that companies paid consultants significant money to solve. He had never thought of any of it as an asset. He had thought of it as his job. The distinction he was seeing for the first time was enormous. Over the following 3 months, David did not quit. He did not take a reckless leap. He did not do anything that anyone around him would have identified as unusual. He had 3 conversations. First, with a former colleague who had left the corporate world 2 years earlier to consult independently. He asked one question: how did you start? What was the first thing? Second, with a small company struggling with exactly the kind of supply chain problem David had spent 14 years solving. He offered to look at their situation for 2 weekends. Not for money, to see if he could help. He could. Third, with his wife. He told her what Arthur had said. He told her about the spreadsheet. He told her he wanted to spend the next 2 years building something alongside the job, not instead of it, and that he needed her to know why. She had known something was wrong for longer than he had. Within 6 months, David had his first consulting client. A small retainer. Not life-changing money, but money that was not contingent on his employer's goodwill. Money that came from something he had built. Within 18 months, 3 clients. The retainers combined were approaching a quarter of his salary. He had not changed his lifestyle. He had not changed his job. He had simply begun, quietly, alongside everything else, to build something that generated value independently. 2 years after that Thursday evening dinner, David had a decision to make. Not a forced decision. Not a crisis. A choice. The consulting income had grown enough that leaving the corporate job was financially survivable. Not comfortable. Survivable. He ran the 4 questions. Is this reversible? Yes. He could return to corporate employment if necessary. Worst realistic outcome? Uncomfortable 18 months. Cost of not deciding? Continuing to trade compounding for salary. He handed in his notice on a Tuesday morning. His manager asked if there was anything the company could do to keep him. David thought about what Arthur had said 2 years earlier about decisions that feel safe. He said no, and meant it. For the first time, he was making a decision based on what it preserved, not what it protected him from. 3 years after that Sunday evening spreadsheet, David Okafor was running a consulting practice serving 4 clients across 2 industries. He earned slightly less than he had at the peak of his corporate salary. He was building assets. He owned what he produced. His income was not contingent on any single employer's decision. He was not wealthy yet. He was building, which, he understood now, was entirely different. Arthur had said something at that dinner that David had written on a card and kept. The safest feeling decision is almost never the safest decision, because the brain measures safety by the absence of visible pain. An invisible cost produces no visible pain. It simply compounds, quietly, continuously, until the day you open a spreadsheet and wonder where 14 years went. Here is what I want you to take from this story. Think about the decisions in your own life that you have labeled safe, not because they produced a visible good outcome, but because they did not produce a visible bad one. And ask yourself, honestly, what those decisions have been costing you. Not in pain, in options, in compounding, in the paths that are slightly more closed today than they were 5 years ago. Because the safety you have been protecting yourself with, the stability that felt responsible, the choices that everyone around you agreed were sensible, may have been protecting you from visible pain, while quietly removing the one thing that builds wealth, the possibility of owning something that grows. The question is not whether your safe decisions were wrong. Many of them were reasonable given what you knew and what you feared. The question is whether, going forward, you are willing to measure safety differently, not by the absence of visible loss, but by the presence of growing options. Because the most expensive decisions most people ever make are the ones that never felt like decisions at all. Just the obvious, sensible, responsible thing to do. And nobody warned them about the cost. If this story made you look at a decision you have been calling safe and wonder what it has actually been costing you, that is exactly what this channel is built to do. Every week we go deeper into the psychology behind why some people build wealth and why equally intelligent, equally hardworking people spend their lives making decisions that feel responsible and lead nowhere they intended to go. Subscribe, because the next story might be the one that changes what you call safe.